Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles,
And I'm Samantha Miller.
and this is your source for wildlife news and the people that make it. On today's episode, we have the National Park Service versus Doge. We have Florida Panthers ×2 and red wolves crossing into the future.
So, Mark, I've been on TikTok again since TikTok wasn't banned. And I was going through the TikTok, and there were people saying that we should just start saying how we're doing like an old-timey explorer would be. So, I want you to know that my mood entering this segment of the news is that the horrors persist, and so do I. How are you feeling today?
Things are good on the Front Range. The weather is breaking. The children
Mm,
are at school.
mm, okay. Then they don't have the scarlet fever or anything. Everyone's holding it up.
No, little Timmy didn't fall in a whale, either a whale or a well. Timmy,
Okay.
or
Good.
the well and the whale.
That's really good. I am so glad to hear that. I feel like um I go back and forth between trying to not watch the news because I feel like I'm on a death spiral, and then consuming all of the news content and then immediately repeating, I'm not going to watch the news anymore. And I think that your first story really covers something that's really, really, really important to talk about. So let's dive into it.
Yeah, news. Bad.
Mm.
And first news segment is Trump firing 1,000 national park workers. And so it's going to have a huge impact on all sorts of programs in the National Park Service around the country. And this is this is not precision scalpel, cutting fat. This is just blanket. Here's 1,000 jobs going away, and it's people that are new or new to their position. And so what it's saying, meaning is that there will be fewer staff. So there'll be shorter visitor center hours. There'll be delayed openings. There'll be closed campgrounds. Trash could pile up. And then there's also programming issues as far as like one woman was fired, uh, and she heads up a search and rescue operation. And so this is like a training position to provide these safety nets for people going out and experiencing the wilderness. And you know, she was just canned right over the weekend, like the rest of the folks. And parks have never been well funded, and to be doing this as we continue to experience more and more people exploring our national parks just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's absolutely devastating. As you know, I live in the Western Gateway to Rocky Mountain National Park. So a lot of my close friends and neighbors are Park Service employees, and the employees that have not lost their jobs, just wake up each morning to see who will have to be fired or who is going next. Same thing across federal agencies that protect our public lands or look at wildlife. I have friends that work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, and they are losing jobs. U.S. Forest Service, they're cutting jobs. And again, I think the important thing for folks to know is it's not a merit-based firing. If you got promoted because you were doing a good job to a new position and you'd only been in that position for less than a year, and sometimes with Park Service, it's 2 years of probation, those people are being fired. And it's really doing a disservice to us. I think a lot of folks also don't know that Forest Service and Park Service does a lot of wildfire mitigation, and they will also travel as firemen too. There are search and rescue employees. So we are cutting our frontline folks who defend the wild. And these are all individuals with families who have made careers in public service. You don't make it, they're not getting rich off the park service. And to cut that to provide tax breaks for the wealthy it's abhorrent.
Yes. You know, if President Trump, if you're listening, which I'm sure he is, uh,
Mhm. What would you say to him?
let's,
Go ahead.
I would say, hey, let's roll back these 1,000 firings. But if you do really want to fire someone, how about aerial gunners and wildlife services?
Ooh, yeah. I was gonna say, how about someone whose last name rhymes with Tusk? But I guess we're not we're not doing that. So yes, aerial gunners, wildlife services. I don't know if they've been cut or not. So folks know wildlife services. We talked about it with Carter Niemeyer a little bit more in depth, but they're the federal wildlife killing program, and they will pay tens of thousands of dollars. Of taxpayer dollars to go up and shoot coyotes on public lands and other animals that could potentially maybe look at livestock like cattle or sheep the wrong way.
Potentially.
Potentially. They haven't done anything yet, but yes, we'd just go up and shoot them from helicopters for fun at the taxpayer's dollar. So yes, I would recommend that cut too. I think that where we are right now is it's really scary. And I hope folks know that we stand with them in this and we see it. And we're trying everything we can to help. I have friends that I'm trying to connect to new positions now too. And it's really scary, but we are in this together.
Yes, we are.
And I think that what we're doing today is covering our sad stories right out the gate and then going to happy stories.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
You're going to build up because at the end of this, we're going to build with two happy stories
Okay.
into a wonderful, passionate, and happy interview.
Oh, that sounds lovely. So, my sad story today is about Florida Panthers. Trump's home state of Florida. Um, they've been witnessing Florida Panthers, especially kittens. This has been more prevalent in kittens, exhibiting strange behavior where they're actually falling over. And it's not staggering disease like we've seen here in Colorado. They're not sure exactly what it is. They've ruled out a couple things. They know it's not a poisonous toad. They know that they that it's a neurological impact that's making them fall the way they're falling. And you can watch video of it too. There's links to watch videos of it, and it's really sad. It's kittens that are barely able to keep up with mom. Again, a Florida panther is an endangered species, and uh, kittens are just falling over that way. So the research being done is trying to figure out, is this a disease? Or could this be caused by things like second generation anticoagulant rodenticides? And we know that from mountain lions like P22, the famous Hollywood mountain lion, that these types of rodenticides are food chain killers, that they are going up the food chain. So let's say you're poisoning rats and a bird eats the rats and then something eats the bird and whatever eats the bird gets it too. So all the way up the food chain and these animals are getting poisoned. So they're really looking into that as a possibility. Time will tell. And so the article will go into it more. Florida Fish and Wildlife or Florida Fish and Game has its own webpage that gives live updates on this issue. Floridians seem to really care about the Panthers, which is great. I'm glad that Florida is so invested in this population of animals. And there's a ton of Q&As on the webpage too. So I'll link that webpage and folks can learn more. But again, things unfolding where we as humans can change things. And one of those things being limiting what types of pesticides and rodenticides we use that really save wild animals.
Yeah. Well, if it is from anticoagulant rodenticides, I mean, that's kind of best case scenario, isn't it? In that it's something that could, since Florida panthers are an endangered species, they're protected. So the move away from these rodenticides I would imagine, would be swift. And so then having a species like that being affected would then uh, protect other species that are also suffering from rodenticide poisoning. So hopefully it's that, and it's not like a biodiversity issue or anything like that. So they haven't have they done any necropsies or blood samples with these cats? Do you know?
Yeah, they absolutely are doing all of that. There is a temporary name for this disorder, which I am not going to try to say, but I will link it. It's a neurological disease, or rodenticide poisoning. We're not sure yet, but they have been doing a lot of research to try to get to the bottom of it. It just takes time.
Gotcha. And and a side note of how to read things wrong. The first time I read about staggering disease in Colorado,
Hmm.
I was like, so what is the disease? It's staggering, but what is it?
there is there is staggering disease in Colorado. You were wondering what it was. That's
Oh,
great.
yeah. Yeah. Like, why won't they just reveal what it is and just tell me? You just keep
Nope.
saying how staggering it is.
No, they will not let you know. They just want you to know it's bad.
It's bad. He won't tell you anymore.
Oh God. Okay. Well, I think that's it. That's it for our sadness. I think we can start going into happy things like red wolves. Tell me a wolf
Yeah.
story.
Well, so this one is literally a bridge from sadness to
Wow.
happiness,
So nice. Good
isn't
good
it?
job.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
you're
So
welcome.
this is titled How a Wildlife Crossing Program Aims to Save Endangered Red Wolves and People. And so this is at a place that every year I put it on my list to go there. It's about 8 hours from my mom's house. It's called the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, and it's on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, and it is home to the last 20 red wolves in the wild. And unfortunately, and the reason they have designated this specific area for red wolf habitat is they tried doing it in the Smoky Mountains, but they kept running into coyotes, and then there's interbreeding that can happen between coyotes and red wolves, and so they wanted to find a spot that was on an island that the coyotes couldn't be there and cause any of those breeding issues. So out on the Outer Banks, the problem they have though is they have been hit by cars in the past. And last June, the breeding male number 2444 was struck and killed on US 64. And when he died, it meant that the five pups that he was providing food for also died as well. And so this was a grant that was done by the Federal Highway Administration. They awarded $125 million for a wildlife crossing pilot program. And unless it's undone by President Trump, they should be able to start uh, rebuilding a 2.5 mile section on the highway, and they're going to put fencing and series of culverts and underpasses so that they'll allow the red wolves. And then there's also black bears out there and wild deer. So just all around safer for these animals to move around this island. So I would love to see more of these programs. It always boggles my mind why insurance companies don't pay for these because of the amount of money they spend just on like white-tailed deers and cars each year. Like, find the areas that are having the most deer strikes and put a wildlife crossing up there. and you're going to end up saving yourself a lot of money and payouts, right? Because everything comes down to money.
Right.
And so we'll solve the problem and don't have to pay out as much in the future.
Right, and do right by the environment. Yeah, I think that those wildlife crossings are so important. And we saw a massive one be built in California to connect the Santa Monica mountain lion population over the 5 freeway because that freeway was taking out lions. And my last story also includes corridors too, which are so essential to protecting habitats while keeping connectivity of wildlife populations. I love red wolves. I'm glad that they were able to get the corridor in. I am circling back to the Florida panther, but not circling like a sad dying kitten, but in a happy way about the Florida panther. Uh, after reading that story, was trying to learn more about the Florida panther population, and I came across a National Geographic documentary called Path of the Panther. And it had everything to do with what happens when humans all come together for a really rare and endangered animal and the difference that people can make for wildlife. So it was very inspiring. It showed how really both livestock producers and environmentalists were working hand in hand to preserve the last wilds of Florida and ensure that there's ongoing habitat for the panther. Producers saw their future and the wilds that they like to ranch on as tied to the panther's future because there were things like huge toll highway projects proposed to go right through rural Florida. And because of the panther, they were able to come together and stop those projects from happening and also ensure the panther's success going forward. So, great documentary. It does discuss some of the illness that the panthers have been experiencing, but it also really tells the story of what we can do as people if we make some changes and come together. So that was my inspiring one for the day, and you can find it. It's on Disney Plus. It's streaming there.
Awesome. Well, I know what I'm doing this evening.
Perfect. Enjoy the path of the panther, everybody.
Well, that wraps it up for news and on to our interview. All right. So we have a special guest today. We have Jad Davenport. He is a National Geographic photographer. He's a writer and a filmmaker as well. He's had a long and storied career that goes ultimately today he's working primarily with wolves in Canada, but he has been a war reporter. He's photographed grizzlies and polar bears and just been all around the world, done underwater photography as well. So I am personally very excited being a photographer myself to have a Nat Geo photographer here, and especially one with such a diverse and storied background. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jad.
Thanks for having me, Mark and Samantha. I'm excited to be here.
One of my favorite parts about your story is that it kind of started right down the street from my house, and so if you could dive into like your early work with foxes, and then kind of get us up to speed on where you are today.
So, yes, I started out not far from where you live right now, not far from where you do a lot of your coyote photography. So, I went to Wheat Ridge High School, just outside of Denver, and I was a terrible high school student. So, I was always ditching. I would go over into the Crown Hill Open Space Park and watch foxes. And I became very intrigued by this family of foxes living there. So I was luckily able to work out an independent study with the principal at Wheat Ridge High School, where she would let me go over there. And I was making a documentary film about these foxes. I was doing some biology independent studies and some writing independent studies. And so it really saved me from being a high school dropout. And it focused me on these fantastic carnivores that were literally across the street from my high school, right in our neighborhood. And that's what's exciting about what you guys are doing with the coyotes. Coyotes are everywhere. And it's the same with foxes. So that really kind of launched my interest in wild canids.
That's what we always say is that coyotes are really the gateway drug to the wild. You know, that coyotes and foxes, urban wildlife, is often the first way that many of us have come to know and appreciate the wild, right? Whether it's foxes or corvids, and how smart those birds are. There's so many different ways that we can engage right in our backyards. And it's so cool to hear your story starting from there to really, I mean, you've taken photos internationally. And so it's just really incredible to know that that's a path that other kids like you could take one day too. Go ahead, Mark. I know you had a question.
Yeah. What does the fox say? It says, stay in
No.
school and find an independent study to do.
And to your
I'm ignoring you.
and to your point, Samantha, I think that's one of the exciting things. You know, I'm a National Geographic photographer. I'm fortunate to travel all over the world, but I didn't start that way. I started at high school. And coyotes, foxes, crows, ravens, these are all accessible animals to everybody anywhere in the United States. So you can, coyotes are definitely a gateway drug to kind of wilder places, but they're just basically small wolves. So if you're interested in wolves, you can go see coyotes right in your own hometown, sometimes right
Yeah.
in your own neighborhood.
Yeah, no, they are. And for me, as much as I love seeing wolves and larger carnivores, I'm kind of stuck on the gateway drug too, and that's okay, because they are so special and so intelligent and everywhere, and they're easy to uh, communicate with others the passion that you can have right in your own backyard. So from your backyard, from your across the street from your high school, you ended up in Wyoming next, correct?
I did. So shortly after graduating from high school, not surprisingly, I did not get into any colleges at all. So I was able to get a job with the U.S. Forest Service. One of my Eagle Scout projects had been looking for black-footed ferrets up in the Pawnee grasslands here in Colorado. Now, at the time, this is back in the 80s, they were considered extinct. And so I spent 3 seasons up in Wyoming working for the U.S. Forest Service, driving around a Jeep at night with a spotlight, trying to find these vanished mustelids, the rarest at the time. It was considered the rarest mammal in North America. And so that was exciting. So this independent study with the foxes launched me into this early career of watching wildlife, but also participating in wildlife studies.
Yeah. So how did you go from looking for black-footed ferrets to a war zone or multiple war zones? Was there a few steps in between?
I think what happened when I was working for the Forest Service and the black-footed ferrets, I had a lot of free time. So I was reading a lot of books about the Vietnam War. My father was a combat vet in Vietnam. He was special forces, and he never talked about the war. So I was reading about the war and getting more and more fascinated. And then at the same time, the movie The Killing Fields came out about the Cambodian genocide. And I was shocked that something I thought was relegated to history, the Holocaust, in Europe, was still happening. And so I think that spurred me to say, okay, I can take my cameras with wildlife and I can make a difference with that. And I could probably do the same thing with human rights. So I decided I was going to be a war photographer. Nobody tapped me on the shoulder. I just saved up my money from Wyoming and took off to Peru to photograph the war with the Sendero Luminoso. And for the next 10 years, that's kind of how my career went. I would come home, save money. No one pays you as a war photographer. It's not a lucrative field at all. So you would send yourself on assignment. And that's always what I tell young people is don't wait for National Geographic to tap you on the shoulder and say, we want you to go photograph wolves in Ellesmere Island or go photograph roadrunners in Arizona. Just save up some money and do it yourself. There's nothing that should keep you back from doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so did you have any close encounters or anything like that during those times in war zones? Were there any memorable stories?
There were a lot of memorable stories. So yes, absolutely a lot of close calls. Some wars had a different feel than other wars. So Northern Ireland, which was a low-level guerrilla war, was had a strange feel in that you didn't see a lot of combat. There would be a car bomb here and there, but there was always this underlying tension between the Catholics and the Protestants. As an American, you kind of floated outside that. And so that would be on one extreme. And the other extreme would be Bosnia. when I was covering the siege of Sarajevo, we were taking 3,000 shells a day on Sarajevo. So it was just unending explosions, 50 people being killed every day or injured. Very cruel war. You know, it was a siege. It was like World War II in Leningrad or Stalingrad. And so, yeah, so a lot of close calls, snipers walking in fields of landmines by accident. You never know. I think the scariest thing about for any war photographer is having an empty road in front of you and thinking, people told me this is safe, but you don't know. And so that's always the scariest thing. Open roads and then checkpoints. You never know what's going to happen at a checkpoint.
The adrenaline from being in a war zone is probably addictive.
I feel like just the uncertainty of being in those spaces. I can't imagine that, but it must have been also must have enabled you to really be able to embrace the quiet of being in wild spaces too. It's interesting to me how often people are intimidated to go into wild spaces when the danger is much more likely to happen on the road outside. So I'm glad you were able to find solace in that after being a war zone photographer, because I can't imagine what you witnessed. And it's sad that we have to witness a lot of loss in the natural world now, too. And so I'd love to hear how you came back from being a war zone photographer and found your way back into wildlife again.
It was a strange transition. I got back from Bosnia and I had decided I didn't want to photograph wars anymore. You spend so much time looking at the dark side of the world and you begin to think the world is a very dark place, when in fact it overwhelmingly is a peaceful place. There are wars going on. Even now, the world is much safer than it was, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And I drifted in back into wildlife photography. I think part of what you're talking about, Samantha, is you spend a lot of time seeing the cruelty of humans to each other and the physical destruction. Just, it's post-apocalyptic. It's crumbled cities and then you're back in the wilderness and it's so healing to be out there. And I think, and to your point, Mark, it is, I mean, the flip side of war photography is it's very addictive. It's very exciting. Every day matters. Every day you wake up and think, this might be my last day. So there's that side of war photography that people don't often talk about. And of course, it's horrifying for the people who are there. And you always feel that. But then to come back and be plopped down in the suburbs, you miss that adrenaline. You miss that sense of purpose. And so for me, starting out guiding with polar bears, studying polar bears up in the Canadian Arctic gave me a chance to find that adrenaline in a more positive way.
You mentioned polar bears, which is one of my favorite animals to talk about and learn about. And I just think they're so fascinating. They're massive. They're so cool. I've never seen them in the wild. I've only seen them in zoos or in natural history museums. I would love to know, what it was like being so close with these bears and what you really learned from them.
Seeing polar bears up close is a thrill. You can, of course, see them from tundra buggies up in the Churchill in Manitoba. All our work we do on foot. And that's something that is just on a whole other level. I've worked with grizzly bears, black bears, and those bears tend to be, you can push them off. They're not 100% carnivorous. The big Kodiaks we see, the fish-eating brown bears, aren't threatening at all. They're after fish. They're almost like cows. You see them walking around the rivers with fishermen. But a polar bear, it's 100% carnivorous. And if you see a polar bear and you're hiking out in the tundra, it's going to come and investigate you. You will always have to deal with a polar bear. And so it's exciting because you learn a whole new set of skills. You have to learn how to interpret polar bear behavior. You have to learn what are your deterrents that you're going to use. And you have to constantly be thinking, what am I going to do if the bear does this? One of the ways I was trained in Canada, I spent a week with grizzly bear biologists because, of course, no one works with polar bears as far as guiding. So our company, the Churchill Wild, is the only company that takes people out on foot. So I got my bear training in Canada with a grizzly bear biologist. And every day I would spend hours in the morning studying their biology, evolution, natural history, behavior. And then every afternoon he would take me out in the field and say, okay, let's go push bears around. And
Yeah.
he would say, this is your bear. And I would have to approach the bear, tell him what kind of behavior I'm seeing. If the bear charged, I'd have to no weapons. You'd have to deter the bear with shouting or waving. The most important thing I learned with bears, and it holds true with polar bears especially, is you don't back down. You never turn and run. You never back up. You always keep the bear off guard. And it's all about anticipating their behavior. Most bears are simply curious. They're out
Yeah.
there on the sea ice and they see you and they say, I wonder what this is. And
Yeah.
so you just have to be prepared when that curiosity starts turning into more predacious behavior.
Yeah, I would love to know what are some non-lethals that you learned that are effective with polar bears?
Oh, it's really funny. With our deterrents with polar bears, people are always surprised. My very first deterrent is simply my voice. Just letting the bear know I know he's there. And so I'll start with my voice. Often I'll carry rocks in my pockets. Even if it's snowy, I'll grab some rocks from the compound of the lodge. And if the bear is coming towards me and it looks like he's on the verge of thinking, let me see if I can scare this thing. Let's see if it runs. I'll snap the rocks. My goal is to always stop their mind from going towards being a predator. So the minute he hears this noise of these rocks clicking together, it forces him to think, wait a minute, I've never heard that noise. So he pauses. If he keeps coming, I'll tag him with the rock. Polar bears have 4 inches of blubber. I'm not going to hurt him, but a rock's going to touch him. Polar bears are not used to being touched, especially from an invisible force. And often that will be enough. Often they'll get, pegged by a rock. They'll stop, they'll turn around, and then I'll use a stern voice and they'll walk off. If that doesn't work, I have a variety of deterrents. I always have a flare pistol I can use, fire off a cracker shell. We do, of course, carry lethal deterrents. In 10 years of working on foot with polar bears, I've never once taken my shotgun off my shoulder. And if I ever did take it off, I would just use it to make a sound. Bear spray is highly effective. My wife and daughters carry bear spray when they hike here, not just for wildlife, but obviously for other humans. Bear spray is, if I was approached by a polar bear and I was on my own, I didn't have to worry about protecting guests, I would fall back on bear spray. I'm not going to shoot a bear if I don't have to. It's the last thing I want to do. And if I ever had to shoot a bear, it would have meant that I made a terrible, terrible mistake.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I certainly have educated people and my kiddo, even he's 7, on the benefits of bear spray. I'll go into the backcountry by myself a lot, and I feel much safer with bear spray than I ever would carrying a gun around. It's easy, it's accessible, and it works for people too. So go ahead, Mark. I know you have a question.
Yeah, well, first, PSA on bear spray: don't fly with bear spray.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
you can't fly with bear spray. I've made that mistake before. You have to get it where you're at.
yes, and then the second, talking about going from war to nature and the peacefulness of nature, but you still get that adrenaline piece. And I know I haven't been mock charged by a polar bear, but I have by elephants. And that difference between being in a vehicle and being on foot, it makes them 3 or 4 times bigger. They're that the situation is that much more dangerous. Like everything just seems so much more real when you're outside of a vehicle. And while most people aren't going to have those kinds of experiences, it is something like in my 3 years in Africa, having elephants charge on foot is something that I'll always remember. And so, I think it sounds like you will always have that bit of of desire for action, no matter what your subject that you're photographing or filming is. And so currently you are in an area. Can you explain where you are you're not currently today, but your area that you do your trips at in Canada? Can you give us a kind of an explanation of what it looks like, how many people around, and what animals you encounter there?
Absolutely. So I work as the director of wolf programs for a company called Churchill Wild. They have 4 or 5 luxury lodges up in the Canadian Arctic. So the one lodge, Nanook Polar Bear Lodge, that I work out of with the wolves is about 120 miles southeast of Churchill. So it's on the southwest corner of the Hudson Bay. It's a fantastic wilderness. It's true wilderness. The lodge sits in the middle of a uninhabited wilderness the size of California, if you can imagine that. It's 50 times the size of Yellowstone. And when I'm up there with people that are participating on the wolf expeditions, we're the only people in that area. So it's truly magnificent. You fly for an hour over just endless boreal forest. Then you come across the coastal Arctic tundra. And then you've got the sea out there, the Hudson Bay. The Arctic Ocean in the winter, you'll have the sea ice. So it's a beautiful area. It's unique in that the boreal forest transitions into tundra in less than half a mile, whereas in other parts of the world, it might take 100 miles, 50 miles to transition from forest to tundra. In winter, you go straight from the boreal forest out onto the sea ice. So what that means is you have a very unique situation with wildlife. You have black bears living right next to polar bears. You have moose of the boreal forest living right next to caribou. You have red foxes of the boreal forest living next to Arctic foxes. So it's this fantastic mix of wildlife that is really only found in this part of the world. And that's where we have the wolves crossing paths with polar bears, which you don't see in any other area in the world. Polar bears might run across a wolf or two up in Ellesmere, but by and large, you're not going to have packs of wolves living next to hundreds of polar bears like you do in the Hudson Bay. In the summertime, when the Hudson Bay melts, all that sea ice melts, so the polar bears come off that sea ice onto land, right into the heart of wolf territory. And so for 6 months out of the year, 5 months out of the year, you have wolves and polar bears coexisting along this narrow strip of coastal wilderness.
But are they always coexisting? Can you tell about the wolf and polar bear interactions?
So one of the challenges with wolves and polar bears is that they both are apex predators. And we have what we're studying right now with Churchill Wild and this citizen science study program that I've set up is we are trying to document encounters between wolves and polar bears and finding out how are the wolves reacting to polar bears, both in the winter and in the summer. What we've noticed in the winter, especially late winter, around March, I'm going to be heading up there in just a few weeks. The mother polar bears are coming out of their dens in the forest, and they've got to take their young cubs out onto the sea ice to start hunting seals. Well, they're going to run this gauntlet of wolf packs cruising up and down the coast. So we've had cases where wolf packs have chased mothers, have attacked mother polar bears, have taken cubs, and this has been recorded nowhere else on the planet. Wolves actually hunting polar bears. And then in the summer, we have had what looks like play behavior where we have polar bears and wolves hanging out, maybe feeding on the same beluga whale carcass. And then all of a sudden, a polar bear will start chasing a wolf. The wolf will do a little run and then play bow and then chase the polar bear. And so I'm not a scientist, but I'm interpreting this. I have a dog. I grew up with dogs. I'm interpreting this as they're actually playing together. And they'll do this for an hour and run back and forth. So yes, they're caught in this strange relationship where one is predator, one is prey. A polar bear can also dig up a wolf den and kill the pups. But I think ultimately what we're finding out is that wolves are the apex predator in the Arctic. There's no match. Two wolves against a polar bear is no match. The polar bear cannot keep facing two wolves at the same time.
Yeah, it's the strength of the pack there. And I imagine where you're going, there's no disruption by humans either. And so as you're seeing these animals, they're truly in their natural state as they would have been before people showed up in the United States. Is that the case up there in the north?
These wolves have never encountered humans, and it's extraordinary. Going back to what you just said, Samantha, we have the great opportunity to watch wolves in a truly wild setting. None of these wolves have been radio collared. None of these wolves have been hunted or trapped. There's no agriculture in the area. There's no husbandry. There are no communities. So these wolves are living their wild life, and we're able to observe what a wild wolf pack does without any interference or pressure from humans. And that's extraordinary. I was
Wow.
talking to Dr. Meach, who's kind of the godfather of wolf studies about this. He's planning on coming up this summer to help us develop our wolf study program even more. And he said, yes, it's very, very hard to find anywhere that wolves don't come into conflict with humans. I mean, even Yellowstone, which we love, and we can go see these wolves, they're accessible. Many of them are radio collared, and the minute they set foot outside that park, they are hunted, trapped, harassed. So I love Yellowstone and it's fantastic, but these wolves don't have the freedom that they should have as wild carnivores.
Right. I would be so curious the differences in wolf behavior. I think to read of how, historic accounts of how wolves were prior to our extermination of them compared to how they are now, and then to have this untouched place where you can know this still exists. I would love to know, are wolves within Yellowstone, are they behaving, in your opinion, differently than wolves that haven't had this kind of negative interaction with humans?
I wouldn't be the best person to answer that question because I haven't spent a lot of time with the Yellowstone wolves. But I will tell you one of the fascinating things about the wolves in our area is because there's never been any pressure by humans in the area. They've never really run into people. They're extremely curious. A wolf down here in the lower 48, if you see it, you're going to be lucky to see it briefly as it runs away because wolves everywhere are hunted, trapped, harassed. Whereas the wolves up there, if we see the wolf pack, we never approach closer than 100 meters. And often that means we're sitting for 4 or 5 hours watching a pack of sleeping wolves. And then at some point, one of them gets up and stretches and notices us. They've probably already smelled us. And the whole pack will walk over and circle us from 2 meters away, from, 6 feet away. I've been out on my own several times doing some photography with them. And I've actually had them come up and sniff my boots and leave a little wet mark on the tip of my boot. And you don't feel threatened by them. But I think it's also important to know they are an apex predator. So that's something I think that our guests have to remember because they see these wolves marching right up to you. We stand our ground, we let them go around, we talk to them, and then they carry off. But I would never want to be out there on my own with a wolf pack on the ground. I think that could get a little dicey. And when I've worked with several First Nations guides up there and some of the older guides and trappers, they've always cautioned me that you always have to be aware that certainly wolf attacks are extraordinarily rare. They were much more common back in the medieval times when you would send 10-year-old kids out to watch the goats and sheep. Of course, wolves would take children. They're easy. But now, especially in the United States, wolves are terrified of people. They're not going to bother you. If you see one here in Colorado, it's going to hightail it out of there. It's not going to approach you.
Yeah, I think in the history of North America, there have only been two fatal wolf attacks that have been documented. So they are incredibly, incredibly rare. But again, having that smart behavior around wildlife as humans, it's our responsibility to interact in a way that's safe. And I think it's a good reminder to folks.
I think it's fascinating. They must know their power. And so knowing that they are the apex predator, knowing that I can approach this big man and not worry for my own safety. It gives them that confidence to be able to investigate. So it just really fascinating there. Um, and it also leads me back to one of our news stories of last week, where we were talking about Nat Geo had covered this subject, where we know from now to 15,000 years ago, humans dominated the domestication of wolves and to getting our present day dogs, but aren't really sure beyond that 15,000 years ago plus. And the hypothesis was a mixture of both humans domesticating wolves and wolves allowing themselves to be domesticated by being tame. So do you, is it blanket? Most of them are very calm and relaxed around you and your group. Are there any of them that display more skittish behavior and maybe the group approaches but one hangs back, or how does that all work?
To your point about evolution and 15,000 years ago and kind of humans' relationship with wolves, I think what's extraordinary is we still see this today. When I talk to the First Nations and collect oral histories, what were their grandfathers' encounters with the wolves? I had one elderly man who told me his grandfather, whenever he was hunting moose, would throw the gut pile and the legs on the outskirts of his camp. And I said, why? And he said, well, then the wolves would come and they would scavenge. And I thought, okay, what the wolves are obviously getting something out of this. What is he getting out of it? And he said they would bark if a polar bear came into camp. And so they had this amazing relationship. And I've come across that many times with oral histories. Sometimes First Nations people taking pups from a den and basically having them as kind of semi-domesticated animals. They'll follow them on the hunt. They'll feed them with the scraps of the hunt, but the wolf can take care of itself. And now, with your question about the different behavior, certainly the older wolves, in this case, Mestakaya, the old white male, I've been watching him for probably 6 years, so he knows me, knows my smell. Very confident animal. Not a large wolf, believe it or not. He's one of the smallest males I've ever seen up there. And he's very confident, but certainly the sub-adults, you'll get that mix of personalities, right? If I can call it personalities, not being a scientist, but you'll get the pups that hang back and are more nervous. And then you'll get the pups when I was photographing them a couple years ago at their rendezvous spot. I would set myself up 100 meters away with the spotting scope. And out of the bushes, one pup just came, walked right over, sniffed around me, circled around me from a couple feet away, and then plopped down and went to sleep practically right next to me. I could have patted him. And he was very comfortable, wasn't scared at all. I think it has to do with the pups observing adult behavior. So if the pups observe that an adult is not frightened of us, then they'll adapt that kind of approach to us as well.
And what is the rendezvous spot?
So a rendezvous spot with wolves, shortly after they're born, a couple of weeks, once their eyes open, once they're able to kind of walk around and explore. And a den could be anything in our area from a hole in a sandy bank, an old Arctic fox den they've excavated. It could be simply that the mom has the pups under a spruce tree, in kind of locked in that kind of thick brush. So eventually she'll move the pups to an open area that has cover. So in our case, it's a meadow with a lot of willowy shrubs around there, willow and birch, so that the cubs can seek shelter if they want, but can also be out in the open. And they will leave the pups there, the pack will. So mom and dad will be off hunting during the day. Sometimes one of the subadults will stay back as almost a babysitter, but sometimes she'll leave them completely unprotected and they'll just, scatter around. They're learning how to howl. So you'll get a lot of these young pups trying their hardest to learn how to howl, and they're very kind of vociferous with that. It's very funny to watch. And then the other wolves will bring back food for them and regurgitate for them. And so the rendezvous site is just an extension of what we call the home site. You have the den and then the rendezvous site. And sometimes, and this may be similar to coyotes, I'd be fascinated to hear your take on it. Sometimes the wolves will have several rendezvous spots. So it might be an open meadow, and then at some point they might decide, okay, we're going to move them over to another meadow next to a stream or something.
Yeah, with coyotes, I'm not certain on the rendezvous spots. I know that they certainly will move den sites if they are feeling pressured. I've seen them move. They're up in Rocky Mountain National Park. Mom and a subadult were moving 9 pups one day because the elk in the meadow did not want them around, and so she had to hightail it and get them out of the middle of the meadow into a safer location. And I got a great photo, not with an elk, but with the pups hanging around, and there's a moose approaching, and one of the pups, thinks he's Mighty Pup and is standing tall and strong and saying, "Get out of here, moose!" And the moose is like, "You're insane." But yeah, so I would imagine that they do have similar behavior like that. Sam, do you have any questions here?
I did. I had one last question, really, and then we can ask some wrap-up questions. And I'm curious how you've seen the environment change with climate change up that far north in Hudson Bay and how that's impacting the animals up there.
That's a great question, Samantha. Climate change, of course, we see it over the long term, right? We see it over decades and centuries. I think when it comes to the Arctic, we are seeing, at least in the last 10 years, certainly climate change is happening. It's tough for me to say what I've seen in the last 10 years if this is, you know, part of the overall trend. We think it is. The ice has been freezing up later in the year and it's been melting earlier in the year. And what that means for the wildlife up there are that the polar bears are coming off the ice earlier onto land where the wolves are. So they're having more exposure to wolves now, and wolves are being more exposed to the polar bears. And the same thing, for instance, I was up there last November at a time of year when usually the bay is all frozen and the polar bears are out on the sea ice hunting seals. And instead, all the bears were lined up on the coast. So they were waiting. It hadn't frozen yet. And this is in late November, early December. So we had wolf packs running around trying to, hunt moose, probably hunt some polar bears as well. And you had the polar bears that they've fasted all summer. They're designed not to eat during the year. They'll take some blueberries, they'll feed on carcasses, but they're fine. So I think they're getting very hungry and they're getting grouchy. And we were running into polar bears. I probably saw in 2 weeks 40 or 50 different polar bears. I've seen up to 100 polar bears in a 1 hour flight along that coast. Now, the polar bears are doing fine in this area. The population is actually going up. Polar bears are probably the wrong animal to use when we look at climate change. You probably want to look at something like a pika that lives in alpine environment. Well, as it warms up, there's only so high it can go on a mountain before it's running out of. These bears have always existed on land and on sea ice. And polar bears historically, if you look back in the fossil record, have gone thousands of years with no sea ice. So they're a very adaptable animal. I'm not worried about the polar bears surviving climate change at all, but I just think it's going to introduce new relationships. For the first time, we also had a grizzly bear, a barren ground grizzly bear in our area. This is the furthest south and east that a grizzly bear has ever been reported. So now grizzly bears, you've got now, and probably because of climate change, you have grizzly bears next to polar bears, next to black bears. This is the only place in the world where you have those three species living alongside each other. So what are we seeing from climate change? I can only tell you what I've seen in my 10 years, and it could be a blip, but certainly climate change is happening. There's no doubt about it. In my 10 years up there, it has definitely gotten warmer. I've had days up there where it's been in 90 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
It's just been hot. The polar bears, of course, don't like the heat. They're out in the water cooling off. So yeah, I would think we are seeing that if I had to take a guess. But again, when you're talking climate change, we're talking hundreds of years in order to get a good feel.
Yeah. No, I think just stories from your time there are really impactful. And I do love that you can see all three species of those bears up there. I didn't know that such a place existed. So that's really fascinating. Mark, did you have any closing questions that you want to ask?
I do. Well, first, I've been holding off on this, but I can't.
Oh,
I can't pass it up.
Okay, go for
With
it.
the 90-degree days, I now know why polar bears like Cokes.
No. Mark, we've said no. You don't get to make your jokes anymore. You're done. But go ahead. Why don't you try again? Not a joke, but you can try for your question.
So I have two questions. So the first one is, obviously polar bears and wolves are exciting and a main draw to that area. Are there other little critters that you get really excited to see when you're up there?
I get excited to see all the wildlife up there, especially during the migration. All the bird life. We're at the top end of the Atlantic Flyway, so all the birds are coming up, and the tundra will go from being empty to just being flooded with hundreds of thousands, probably millions of birds. That's always exciting. Personally, I've probably seen half a dozen wolverine, and
Wow.
that is always a thrill to see because they're not an endangered species. They're not rare, but they're very secretive. And so coming across a wolverine and being able to watch a wolverine do his little wolverine things is always a treat. And I don't buy this their reputation as the toughest animal on the planet. They certainly can be defensive, but whenever they see us, they'll bolt. I've watched the wolf pack several times tree wolverines. All the pups
Wow.
so excited. They see a wolverine and boy, they're after it. And the wolverine will, scramble, climb up a tree, and he'll sleep there for 6 hours until the wolves lose interest. And then he'll climb down and go off there. But I enjoy seeing that. I love seeing the caribou. Caribou are always exciting. Yeah, all the wildlife up there. It's just so fascinating.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so my last question is, in March you're heading up that direction, and I believe you have a spot or two left for that expedition, right? And how does one find out how to join one of your trips? And can I
Sure.
fit in your suitcase?
Yeah, I know. Oh gosh, I wish I could bring you guys all up. That's one of the things. The Arctic travel is so outrageously expensive. Most of fees go towards airfare because it's so remote. So if people want to join me on a wolf expedition, I lead 4 wolf expeditions a year for Churchill Wild Safaris. It's a Canadian company, and people will join me for 10 days at a time. Sometimes people will sign up for the full 20 days. They'll do back-to-back expeditions. So we fly up from Winnipeg, Manitoba, up to Nanook Polar Bear Lodge, and then we're out every day for 10 days. We're out tracking the wolves in the snow. We're doing howl surveys to see if we can find where they are. We're looking for moose carcasses, any kind of kills, and we're documenting those. We're setting up a whole network of trail cameras. So we're recording behavior. At this time of year, this March will be fascinating because we have our local pack, the Opiasan, the big wind pack, is down to 5 individuals, including the leader, Mestakaya, the breeding male, and they're up against the 12-member Kaskatama pack, the pack of the meat eaters, it's called, and they've been fighting over territory. So it will be very interesting to see what happens when we get up there. I expect a lot of action. So people can come up, they can sign up for one of these expeditions through Churchill Wild Safaris. They can join me. I'm as a National Geographic photographer. I'm also working with people that want to study photography or amp their photography up to the next level. But it's a lot of hands-on citizen science. And we're getting a lot of great help from people like Kira Cassidy and Dave Meach, who are famous in the wolf world, on how can we do this? How can we contribute to science? Because scientists really can't get up there. It's so expensive. If you can study wolves in Yellowstone, where your access is much closer, you're going to go there. You're not going to pay tens of thousands of dollars to fly into a remote wilderness. Even if you could get there, if you set up a tent, you're going to have to deal with polar bears instantly. So you're going to be dead. There's no way you can go and camp on that coast and watch wolves. So
Yeah.
it's really the only way, and it's a way that we are able to contribute to science, and we're pretty excited about it. And the fact that it is hands-on, it's as I tell people, it's not like you go to a resort in the Bahamas and you participate in citizen science by planting a coral polyp and they give you a little certificate. No, you're out there 8 hours a day in minus 40-degree temperatures on skidoos and Inuit sleds, and you're helping me do the work in the field. And ultimately, of course, the payoff are those brief moments when you find the wolves, you get to share that time with them, and they come up and they look at you right in the eye. There's a huge difference, as you know from your time in Africa, from an animal seeing you as part of a group from 100 meters away to when an animal is standing right in front of you looking at you, Mark, or you, Samantha. And that moment with the wolves when that happens is just transcendent. You really feel like I understand this wolf and this wolf understands me. And I think one of the things, Mark, too, that makes wolves and coyotes and foxes so fascinating is that I grew up with dogs. I'm guessing you guys probably both grew up with dogs as well. I didn't grow up with a baby polar bear. I can't, when I'm out looking at a polar bear, everything I learned about that polar bear, I learned from reading. When I go out and watch wolves or coyotes, I'm already an expert on their behavior because I have one at home. I've got a Canis lupus, a wolf right upstairs in my house. And so I can tell you if this wolf is sad, if it's anxious, if it's happy, if it's proud. And that's what's exciting for me is that people that come on these wolf expeditions, I always say, look, you're already an expert on wolf behavior if you spent time around dogs. Now let's just get out, let's find them, and let's see what they're doing.
Very, very cool. Well, my last question really is if folks can't afford to get up there, what's a great way that folks can learn more about that area from their home?
learning more about that area without going up there is definitely possible. I would encourage people to check out the International Wolf Center in Ely, Minnesota. They are a fantastic resource on wolves. It was set up by Dave Meach. It's kind of a museum / zoological reserve where they have wolves that can't be released to the wild, but they do a lot of online seminars, which are fantastic, so people can learn about that. And of course, we get a lot of people that want to go up and study the wolves, and it's expensive, right? You're talking tens of thousands of dollars. I think it's about $16,000 now for people to come up and join us on the wolf expedition. And I could certainly never afford to do it if I wasn't working up there. But what I will say is exactly what you guys are doing. You have wolves right here in Colorado, right here in your home state, that are smaller than the wolves. They're the coyotes. And if you want to come and you want to get a taste for what wolves are like, go watch coyotes, because they are nothing more than a small wolf. They're extremely social. You're going to see the same behaviors. You're going to get that same intuitive flash of what the behavior is. It's engaging. It's not like watching a black bear that you don't understand the behavior. So learning more about wolves, absolutely. Look at online seminars. I post a lot on my Instagram about wolves, the International Wolf Center, and I know the Coyote Project. That's a fantastic resource as well. Anywhere you can start learning about wild canids, all that information is useful in crossing.
Yeah. Well, thank you for our plug for our neighbors, the Coyote, and for Project Coyote. And so you mentioned your Instagram, and we'll wrap up there. So where do we find you on social media?
On social media and Instagram and Facebook, I'm just at Jad Davenport.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. This has been such a pleasure. And I often found myself in Canada as you were speaking, visualizing what you were telling. So amazing storyteller and just life experience. And we're very thankful for you to join us today.
Thank you so much, guys. It's exciting. And I'm excited about the work you're doing with coyotes. I think they are a fantastic animal. They're fascinating and they're adaptable, and we're coexisting with them. That's what's extraordinary. We can do that with wolves. Yeah. There's nothing that says we can't coexist with wolves like we coexist with coyotes.
Absolutely. We'll end it there on that note of positivity. This has been an episode of The Wildlife Wire with me, Mark Searles, and my co-host, Samantha Miller. Thank you for listening.